2 million people were watching when my son-in-law took the microphone and smiled at my daughter like she was something he had already thrown away. I was 63 years old, sitting behind a desk on the 34th floor of the Caldwell Energy Tower in downtown Houston when my personal phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. No message, just a link, and 3 words typed beneath it. "You should watch." I pressed play. The footage came through immediately. A ballroom, the kind that gets rented out for conferences and galas, and the sort of events where powerful people go to remind each other how powerful they are. Chandeliers burning overhead, 600 guests in formal wear moving between tables, set with white linen and centerpieces that probably cost more than most people's car payments. The camera was steady, held by someone who knew how to hold it. Someone who had clearly decided this moment was worth capturing in full. Then it found her. My daughter was standing alone at the center of the floor. She was 6 months along, and her white dress had been soaked through with champagne. Not spilled, not splashed by accident, but poured deliberately. The kind of thing you do when you want to make a point in front of as many witnesses as possible. The stain ran from her shoulder, down across the fabric in long, uneven streaks. Around her 600 people were talking, drinking and laughing at something one table over. Not one of them had moved toward her. Her right hand was pressed flat against her stomach. Not dramatically, not for the camera, just quietly, instinctively, the way you cover something you are trying to protect when the room around you stops feeling safe. Derek had the microphone. My son-in-law, a man I had watched walk through my office door 7 years ago, with a practiced smile and a rehearsed speech about how much he loved my daughter, was standing at the front of that room like he owned every inch of it. His voice came through the footage clean and unhurried. The voice of a man who had never once, in 7 years, considered the possibility that the ground beneath him might belong to someone else. "Look at her," he said. He let the silence sit for a moment, the way performers do when they want the audience to feel the weight of what comes next. This is what happens when you think love is enough to build a life on. My daughter's voice came through raw and unsteady, the edges of it fraying in a way I had not heard since she was 7 years old, and her mother had to explain why the family dog wasn't coming home. "I am carrying your child," she said. Derek laughed. One short sound, like the idea, genuinely surprised him with how little it changed anything. That, he said, is exactly the problem. I set my phone face up on the desk and looked at it without looking away. On the screen, 600 people shifted in their seats. Some of them laughed. Somewhere near the back, a man I recognized raised his glass in a small, satisfied toast, the kind that says, "I always knew this was coming." I noted his face. I filed it away the way I file everything cleanly, completely, without letting the feeling attached to it interfere with the information itself. My right hand moved to the armrest of my chair. I felt my fingers close around the leather. I was aware, very specifically aware of the choice not to tighten my grip, of what that discipline cost, of exactly how many seconds I held it before I let go. 4 seconds. That was all I allowed myself. Then I picked up the phone again. Not to watch more. I had seen enough. I had, in fact, seen everything I needed to see 7 years ago, in a different room with a different kind of evidence. Tonight was not a surprise. Tonight was a confirmation. I stood up from the desk, walked to the window. Houston, on a Friday evening, sat indifferent and bright. Below me, the city, running its ordinary machinery with no awareness of what was happening, 34 floors up or 30 blocks south. The kind of city that doesn't stop for anyone's worst night. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. 63 years old, black suit, a face that by practice and by nature gave nothing away. On the desk behind me, the footage was still playing. My daughter was still standing in that room, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, chin level, not collapsing, holding the way her mother used to hold in the middle of things that had no good answer. I turned away from this window, reached for my jacket. I set the phone face down on the desk. Then I picked up a different one, the one I had been saving for exactly this moment. The jacket had been hanging on the back of my chair since 6 o'clock that morning. I put it on the way I put on everything. Left arm, first collar, straight, each button from the bottom up. Deliberate, unhurried. The same way I had dressed for the first day I walked into a bank and asked for a business loan with nothing but a set of blueprints and the kind of certainty that has no business existing in a 26-year-old with empty pockets. 57 years of mornings had taught me that how you carry yourself in the small moments determines how you hold up in the large ones. I checked my reflection in the darkened glass of the window. 63 years old. A face that had learned over decades to keep its own counsel. Houston stretched out below me, 34 floors down, running its Friday night the way it always did. Indifferent, bright, enormous. The lights of downtown spread south toward the ship channel, and beyond that, the flat dark of the Gulf Coast horizon swallowed everything. Somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary light, 30 blocks south and 6 floors up, in the George R. Brown Convention Center, my daughter was standing alone in a ruined dress with one hand pressed against her stomach. I had not spoken to Megan in 14 months. The distance between us had not happened all at once. It never does with the people you love. It accumulates: one unanswered call, one visit cut short, one conversation that ends in silence, because neither side knows how to cross back over what was said. She had wanted to build something on her own terms. I had understood that, even when it hurt. Her mother had understood it better than I had. Grace always understood Megan better than I did. My wife had been gone for 6 years. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it has already made up its mind. In the last months of her life, Grace had spent a great deal of time sitting in the library of our house on Memorial Drive, sometimes reading, sometimes just looking out at the garden, with the particular stillness of someone who is sorting through things that don't fit into words. I had sat with her when she let me. Other times, she needed the quiet for herself, and I had learned to respect that too. One evening, about 3 weeks before the end, she had looked up from whatever she was holding and said without preamble, the way she always said the things that mattered most, "Let her find her own footing, Robert, even when it scares you, especially then." I hadn't asked who she meant. We both knew. I turned back to the desk. The phone I had set face down was still where I'd left it. I picked it up and turned it over. The footage was still running. Megan hadn't moved. Same position, same posture, shoulders back, chin level, right hand, flat against her stomach. The champagne had dried into the fabric in long, rust-colored streaks, and her hair was still damp at the temples, where it had run down. Around her, the room had moved on. People were at the bar. Someone was laughing at a table near the east wall. The machinery of the evening was continuing as though nothing of consequence had occurred at the center of it. She was holding. That was what I noticed most. Not collapsing, not looking for the exit. Holding the way Grace used to hold in the middle of things that had no clean resolution, with a stillness that came not from the absence of feeling, but from the decision to remain standing in spite of it. This was not the first time I had watched my daughter from a distance and chosen not to close it. There had been other nights, other windows, evenings when I had sat in a parked car on a quiet street in the Montrose neighborhood and watched the light in her second-floor apartment and told myself that being close enough to know she was all right was enough. It had not always felt like enough, but it had been the choice I made, and I had made it with my eyes open, and I had lived inside it without complaint, because the alternative, inserting myself into a life she had asked me to step back from, would have cost her something I wasn't willing to take. Tonight was different. Tonight, the distance I had kept was no longer protecting her. It had run its course. Whatever it had needed to accomplish, it had accomplished. And what was left now was not patience or strategy or the long geometry of a plan quietly assembling itself in the background. What was left was a father and his daughter and a room full of people who were about to understand something they hadn't considered before tonight. I set the phone in my breast pocket, picked up the second phone from the desk, the one with the call already queued, the one I had been keeping charged and ready for a Friday that felt for 7 years like it was always just ahead of me. Tonight I said to the empty office, "The Caldwells, take back what's theirs." I walked to the elevator. The doors opened without a sound. Connor was already at the curb when I came through the lobby doors. My son, 32 years old, built like a man, who had spent his 20s learning that patience and precision matter more than speed, had the engine running and the passenger door open before I reached the sidewalk. He didn't ask questions. He never did on nights like this, and there had been enough of them over the years that he had developed a particular kind of readiness for them, the kind that doesn't require explanation. He pulled into traffic on Louisiana Street and pointed the SUV south toward Interstate 10 without being told. The city moved past the windows in its usual Friday rhythm restaurants, lit-up couples on sidewalks, the ordinary evidence of people having ordinary evenings. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough," I said. He nodded once and said nothing else. That was Connor. He had learned somewhere in his late 20s that the most useful thing a person can do in a moving vehicle is drive. I-10 opened up ahead of us, and he took the on-ramp with the smooth confidence of someone who had driven this stretch of highway more times than he could count. Houston, spread out in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the kind of city that swallows problems whole and keeps moving. "He planned this," Connor said after a while. "Tonight wasn't an accident." "No," I said. "It wasn't." "How long have you known?" I looked out at the highway. 7 years, I said. "Give or take?" Connor's hands shifted on the wheel. Not a dramatic movement. Just the adjustment of a man recalibrating the scale of something he thought he already understood. "I want you to think back," I said to 7 years ago. "The evening Derek Holloway sat across my desk and asked for permission to marry your sister." Connor said nothing. He remembered the evening. He had been in the adjacent room. "He came in performing," I said. Every word scripted. The humble ambition. The self-made conviction. The love that didn't need anything from the Caldwell name. He had rehearsed it well. I'll give him that. He sat down in that chair like he owned it, and he looked me in the eye, and he delivered the whole thing without a single crack in the surface. "I put a 47-page prenuptial agreement on the desk between us," I said. My attorneys had spent 6 weeks drafting it. Core terms were straightforward. If the marriage ended due to deception, psychological harm, financial fraud, or willful damage to Megan or any children of the marriage, he would walk away with exactly what he brought in. Nothing more. Connor glanced at me briefly, then back at the road. "He signed it," I said. 47 pages, 45 seconds. He didn't read past page 4. "A man who signs what he hasn't read," Connor said slowly, "because he's too busy performing confidence to exercise caution." "Exactly," I said. That signature told me everything I needed to know. Not about his ambition, I already knew about that. About his discipline. About the gap between how he presented himself and how he actually operated when he thought no one was paying close enough attention. I folded my hands in my lap. "So I made a decision," I said. I could have blocked the marriage, used the family's legal resources to make it difficult enough that it fell apart on its own. I considered it. But Megan loved him. That part was real. Her love was completely real. And if I had gone to her with suspicions and legal maneuvers, she would have believed I was doing what I had always done, trying to manage her life from a distance. She would have married him anyway, and she would have done it without the safety net I was about to build. I kept my voice even, so instead, I said, over the following 18 months, I directed $180 million through 4 Caldwell subsidiary funds into Derek's company. Anonymous vehicles, layered structures. He believed the capital came from independent investors who recognized his talent. He believed it because men like Derek always believe the market is simply catching up to what they already knew about themselves. Connor was quiet for a moment. "And the land," he said. "Every development project he has touched in 7 years," I said, "sits on ground acquired through one of 12 holding companies. Different names, different registered agents, different states of incorporation. He signed the leases. He broke ground. He put his name on the buildings. I paused. Every piece of land Derek Holloway ever built on, I said. Check the deed. Connor reached for the tablet mounted on the center console. His fingers moved across the screen, pulling up the file structure I had sent him earlier that afternoon. The SSUV held steady at highway speed, while he scrolled through the first layer of documents, then the second, cross-referencing holding company names against the property records he had pulled from the Harris County database. His hands stopped moving. The tablet sat in his lap screen, still lit, the cursor resting on a name in the third column of a corporate registration filed 8 years ago in the state of Delaware. Dad, Connor said quietly, "There's a name here I didn't expect to see." I had known about Frank for 4 years. My brother, older than me, by 6 years, the man who had taught me to read a set of construction blueprints on a folding table in our father's garage in Beaumont when I was 12 years old, had been in that file since the beginning. I had simply chosen not to put his name on the surface of it, where Connor might find it before I was ready. Frank Caldwell had never forgiven me for a decision I made 20 years ago. When Caldwell Energy Group restructured its ownership in the early years of its growth, I had declined to bring him in as an equity partner. It was not personal, and I had tried to explain it that way at the time. He had the instincts, but not the discipline. He spent money the way men spend money when they believe more is always coming. Bringing him into the ownership structure would have introduced a variable I couldn't manage, and the company was still too fragile to absorb that kind of uncertainty. Frank had heard my explanation. He had nodded, shaken my hand, and never brought it up again. He had also never let it go. 8 years ago, at a family gathering over Thanksgiving, at my house, on Memorial Drive, Frank had introduced Derek Holloway to Megan. He had presented him as a young developer, with a sharp mind and real potential, someone he had met through a mutual contact in the commercial real estate world. The introduction had lasted about 4 minutes. By the end of the evening, Derek and Megan had exchanged numbers. I had not known then what I know now. What I know now is that the meeting was not coincidental. I had sat with that knowledge for 4 years without saying a word to Connor or to Megan or to anyone else, not because I lacked the evidence, but because Megan had grown up with Frank at every Christmas dinner and every summer cookout and every birthday party that mattered. He was the uncle who remembered what she liked, who asked the right questions, who showed up. Telling her what he had done would have required her to dismantle something she had built over a lifetime, and she had enough to dismantle already. Some information you carry alone, because the cost of sharing it is higher than the cost of holding it. Connor was quiet in the driver's seat. The highway stretched ahead of us, the lights of the convention center beginning to appear on the horizon several miles south. And then I said 3 months ago, something else arrived. I looked out at the road. A woman named Rachel Hines called my private office line on a Tuesday morning in late July. She identified herself as the former head of accounting at Derek's development company, a position she had held for 3 years before leaving 18 months prior. Her voice was steady, in the way that voices get when someone has rehearsed what they are going to say enough times that the emotion has been pressed down beneath the surface of the words, but not so far that you can't hear it underneath. She told me that Derek had a son, a boy named Liam, 7 years old, living in Denver, Colorado, with his mother. That mother was Rachel herself. She told me that she and Derek had been married in Denver in the spring of 2016, 8 months before he stood at an altar in Houston and made the same promise to my daughter. She wasn't calling for money. She was calling, she said, because Derek had recently informed her that he intended to make certain complications in his life disappear before the end of the year. She had understood from the specific way he said it that she and Liam were among those complications. She had a signed copy of a fraudulent escrow agreement that implicated Derek in a scheme to redirect investor funds, a document she had quietly photographed and kept on the day she realized what she was looking at more than 2 years before she ever called me. She had held on to it because she didn't know who to trust. She was calling me because she had run out of other options. I spent 3 weeks verifying everything she told me. Property records, court filings, The marriage certificate pulled from the Denver County Clerk's office through a title search company that had no connection to anything with my name on it. Every detail checked, every document confirmed. When I called her back, I told her to stay in Denver. Keep Liam close. Don't change her routine. Don't make any sudden moves, and don't contact Derek under any circumstances. She asked me how long it would take. I told her it would be finished by the end of October. She asked me how I could be so certain. I told her the truth. Because Derek had spent 7 years building me everything I needed. He just didn't know it yet. The George R. Brown Convention Center appeared through the windshield, about a mile out, its exterior lit against the October sky, in a wash of gold and white that made it look from a distance like something built to impress. Which was, of course, exactly the point. Derek had chosen this venue the way he chose everything for maximum visibility, maximum scale, maximum opportunity to remind the people in the room of how far he had come. What he had not considered when he booked it 14 months ago was who owned it. Connor eased off the accelerator without being asked. The SUV slowed to a cruise as we covered the last half mile. The convention center growing in the windshield with the slow, certain approach of something that had been waiting for us to arrive. Derek thought he designed the trap, I said. He was right about that. He designed it for the wrong person. Connor kept his eyes on the road. Walk me through it, he said. 3 weeks after Derek announced the event, I said his communications team, through a third-party firm with no visible connection to his company, began reaching out to digital distribution networks. The arrangement was straightforward. The evening's program would be broadcast live on a major viewing platform framed as an industry keynote. The real intention, as outlined in the internal brief that his PR contact had carelessly left on a server I happened to have access to, was different. The broadcast would capture the confrontation Derek had already planned, the moment he intended to use as the final public, irreversible severing of his connection to Megan and to this family, distributed to as wide an audience as possible. Time-stamped. Impossible to walk back. He wanted witnesses, I said. He wanted the whole thing on record. Connor glanced at me. I gave him what he wanted, I said. Jimmy Park, a systems technician who had worked venue audiovisual contracts across the Houston Convention corridor for 11 years and who had been on my facility's payroll as an independent contractor for the past 3 of them, had been on site since 2 o'clock that afternoon. His credentials were legitimate. His equipment was standard. There was nothing about his presence in the technical booth that would have drawn a second look from anyone on Derek's event staff. What Jimmy controlled from that booth was every camera feed in the building. Not just the broadcast feed Derek's team had set up. All of them. The fixed cameras mounted in the upper corners of the ballroom. The roaming units assigned to the stage. The backup feed running to the secondary production board. Every angle, every frame, every second of footage that would go out to the 2 million people who had tuned in that evening expecting to watch a business keynote and were about to watch something considerably more consequential. Derek had built the stage, I said. He had arranged the lighting. He had written his own lines and rehearsed his own delivery and invited his own audience. He had done everything right by his own estimation, right up until the moment he failed to ask one question. Connor said, "Who controls the feed?" "Who controls the feed?" I said. The convention center filled the windshield, now close enough that I could make out the figures moving under the entrance. Canopy, valets, arriving guests. The ordinary choreography of an event that had no idea. Its evening had already changed direction. A line of town cars at the curb. Staff in dark jackets holding clipboards. The bright rectangle of the main entrance doors open and waiting. Connor brought the SUV to the curb in a single, clean motion. The tires caught the asphalt with a short, definitive sound. He put the vehicle in park and looked at me. "Ready," he said. "Not the way you ask a question. The way you confirm that the answer is already understood." I looked at the entrance. 40 feet of open pavement between the curb and those doors. Beyond them, 600 people who had come to watch Derek Holloway perform the final act of a story he believed he had written himself. Most of them had no idea who had been holding the pen. That was about to change. I opened the door and stepped out. The entrance was 40 feet away. I didn't slow down. The room changed before I reached the door. Not all at once. It moved the way a power outage moves through a city block. One section going quiet, then the next, until the sound of 600 people talking and laughing and clinking glasses dropped away, table by table, and left something else in its place. The particular silence of a room that has recognized something and is still deciding what to do about it. I didn't pause at this entrance. I didn't look for a reaction or wait for the current of attention to reach every corner. I had been in enough rooms in my life to know that hesitation reads as uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing you cannot afford when you are walking toward your daughter. The crowd parted without being asked. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet, instinctive way of people who sense, on some level, they can't fully articulate that the man moving through the center of the room is not someone who expects to be stopped. Small steps backward, bodies shifting, a lane opening through the middle of the floor, without anyone consciously deciding to create it. That is what 40 years of building something real looks like, in a room full of people who recognize it. You don't move the crowd moves itself. I kept my eyes on Megan. She was exactly where the broadcast had shown. Her far side of the floor, standing alone against the backdrop of the east wall. The dress had dried since I last saw her on that screen. The champagne stain gone from dark wet to a deep rust color that caught the light in long, uneven streaks across the white fabric. 6 months along, and she was carrying herself the way her mother used to carry herself, in the middle of difficult things, straight, spine, chin level, right hand, resting flat against her stomach. She saw me from across the room. Her face did something I hadn't seen in 5 years. Something that started to open and then tried to close again, because she was a Caldwell, and there were 600 people watching. And Caldwells do not come apart in public. She almost managed it. She made it most of the way. I covered the last 20 feet without slowing down. I had been wearing my jacket since 6 o'clock that morning. I shrugged it off my shoulders in one motion as I reached her and placed it around her, without breaking stride, covering the stain, covering the damp fabric, covering the evidence of what had been done to her in this room over the past hour. My hand rested on her shoulder for one moment. "Megan," I said. I kept my voice low. "Just for her." "Dad," her voice was barely holding its shape. "I'm sorry. I should have." He said, "I didn't have anyone left." He said, "Look at me," I said. She looked up. "You have me," I said. "You have Connor. That is not nothing. That has never been nothing." Her chin was trembling. The rest of her was absolutely still, the kind of stillness that costs something, that requires a decision to maintain it, that I recognized because I had watched her mother maintain it in circumstances that would have undone most people. She didn't cry. My daughter has never cried in public in her adult life. That is grace down to the bone, carried forward in a way that no one taught her and no one had to. She nodded once, small, controlled. Her eyes stayed on mine. 5 years of distance, 5 years of missed dinners and unanswered calls and evenings spent parked on a quiet street, watching a light in a second-floor window, compressed themselves into the 3 seconds we stood there, looking at each other. I don't know how else to describe it. The distance didn't disappear so much as it became suddenly and completely irrelevant. We were standing in the same room. That was what mattered. That was all that had ever mattered. Then from my left, a voice. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" It wasn't a question. Derek delivered it the way he delivered everything, flat, measured, the voice of a man who had spent years training himself to sound like the most certain person in any room he entered. He was standing about 12 feet away, the wireless microphone still in his hand, his jaw set in the particular way of someone performing a composure he no longer fully possessed. His eyes moved from me to Megan and back again. Something was running behind them, fast, calculating, not yet finished, arriving at whatever conclusion it was building toward. Robert, he said. You were not invited. I turned to face him. Not fast, not slow. The way you turn when you already know exactly how this ends. Derek had the look of a man who still believed he had cards to play. That was the first thing I noticed when I turned to face him. Not the anger, which was there controlled and running just below the surface, but the calculation behind it. His eyes were moving, taking stock, measuring the distance between what he had planned for this evening and what was currently unfolding in front of him, and still, even now, searching for the move that closed that distance in his favor. He had always been a fast thinker. I had never disputed that. Robert, he said again, his voice dropping half a register into something that was meant to sound authoritative. You need to leave. This is a private event. I clasped my hands in front of me. Security, he said louder, this time, turning his head toward the perimeter of the room. Someone get security up here. My son's voice came from my right. Connor, who had come through the side entrance while I was crossing the floor, exactly as we had arranged, stepped forward with the particular stillness of a man who has spent his whole life learning when to move and when to hold. He was 32 years old, and he filled the space beside me the way his grandfather used to fill a room without effort, without announcement. The security team in this building, Connor said, reports to Caldwell Group Facilities Management. He paused just long enough for that to land. Daniel Reeves, the head of venue security, a man who had been on our facilities payroll for 9 years, completed his briefing with the full staff at noon today. They have been in position since 6 o'clock this evening. As if on cue, 4 members of the venue security team moved from their stations along the perimeter walls. No raised voices, no urgency. They repositioned themselves at the main exits with the calm, unhurried efficiency of people executing a plan that had been arranged well in advance. Every guest in the room watched it happen. Derek watched it happen. I let the silence sit for a moment. The George R. Brown Convention Center, I said, has been a Caldwell Group property since the spring of 2020. The acquisition was processed through a commercial real estate fund, a vehicle that until tonight had no visible connection to my name. I looked at him steadily. The lease agreement for this evening was filed through a subsidiary, which means the floor you're standing on, Derek, the microphone in your hand, the chairs your guests have been sitting in all evening. I paused. All of it is mine. It has been mine for 4 years. Something moved through the room. Not sound exactly, more like the collective intake of breath that happens when 600 people process the same information at the same moment and find they don't quite have a framework for it yet. Derek's jaw tightened. That's, he started. Connor set a bound folder on the table beside us. Dark blue cover, no label. The kind of document my attorneys produce when they need a judge to understand something without ambiguity. Open it, I said. Derek looked at the folder, then at me, then at Connor, then at the 4 security personnel standing at the exits. The calculation was still running behind his eyes, but it was starting to come back wrong, and I could see the moment he understood that. He opened the folder. The first page was a corporate structure chart. Clean, precise, the kind of document that leaves no room for interpretation. At the top, the Caldwell Development Trust. Below it, a cascade of subsidiary holding companies, spreading downward in labeled branches, each one connected to the next by documented ownership lines. Highlighted in yellow at multiple points throughout the structure, the registered names of every significant capital partner Derek's company had worked with over the past 7 years. He turned pages. His hands were not entirely steady. Every dollar, I said, that went into building what you call your company traveled through at least one entity in that chart before it reached you. 12 of them in total. Different names, different states of incorporation, the same source. Derek looked up from the page. You weren't building an empire, I said. You were building my case. There is a difference. I let him sit with that. Then I looked past him, toward the east side of the room, toward the table near the wall, where a man I had known for most of my adult life was sitting very still in a dark suit, watching the stage with an expression that had been carefully emptied of everything it might otherwise contain. Frank Caldwell, my older brother, the man who had set this in motion 8 years ago at a Thanksgiving dinner on Memorial Drive, met my eyes across the room. He held them for exactly as long as it took for both of us to confirm what we already knew. Then he looked away. Frank's part 1 said quietly, will be handled separately. Tonight is about you. I turned back to Derek. Open it, I said. He opened the folder, and the color left his face all at once, like lights going out. He closed the folder before he had finished reading it. Not because he had seen enough, because he had seen too much. Derek set it on the table with the careful, deliberate motion of a man trying very hard to look like the document in front of him did not represent everything he had spent 7 years attempting to conceal. He straightened up, reset his shoulders, reached for the version of himself that had walked into this room 2 hours ago, fully convinced the evening belonged to him. That version, I noted, was becoming harder for him to locate. This is circumstantial, he said. Corporate structures, holding companies. You can layer ownership through a dozen entities and prove nothing about intent. My attorneys, show me proof, Connor said. Derek looked at him. Real proof, Derek said, picking up the word and redirecting it. If you're going to stand here and dismantle everything I've built, then show me something that isn't a spreadsheet. Show me something that didn't come from your own people. One piece of evidence that stands on its own. He was looking at me when he finished. The calculation was still running. He still believed, I think, that there was a move available to him, that the right combination of confidence and legal language could reframe what was happening in this room into something manageable. I looked across the ballroom floor toward the technical booth positioned along the far left wall, where Jimmy Park had been standing at his station for the past 40 minutes, waiting for exactly this signal. I gave it one look, nothing more. Jimmy turned to his board. The main display screen, 15 feet wide, installed along the rear wall of the stage during the venue's last renovation, went dark. Not dimmed, completely dark. The kind of black that makes a room feel suddenly smaller. 600 people looked at it. 3 seconds passed. The silence in those 3 seconds had a texture to it, the particular quality of a large group of people holding themselves very still because something is happening that they don't yet understand. Then the screen came back. The footage that appeared was not polished. It was not produced. It was the fixed angle overhead output of a standard building security camera, the kind installed in commercial office spaces as a matter of routine, the kind that tenants sign acknowledgement forms about on the day they move in, the kind that records continuously onto servers housed in building infrastructure that in this particular case had been managed by a Caldwell Group technology subsidiary since the property changed hands 3 years ago. The timestamp in the upper left corner read March 3rd, 11:47 in the evening. The room was conference room B 12th floor, Holloway Development offices. Derek was at the table. Across from him sat a woman, the same woman who had called my private line on a Tuesday morning in late July, whose voice I had spent 3 weeks verifying against every document she had sent me. She had a glass in front of her. She looked relaxed. She was not. The audio came through the venue's speaker system. Clean, unhurried, the same speakers Derek had used 2 hours ago to address 600 people about his own success. The timing Derek's voice said has to work with the road conditions on the eastbound stretch between the suburbs and downtown. There's an overpass section with a low barrier on the right shoulder. If the brake line is compromised in the right way, it reads as standard wear. Nothing that opens an investigation. The woman's voice quieter. And the other situation, the one she mentioned last week. A pause. 3 seconds of it. If she doesn't make it through the accident, Derek said, the other situation resolves itself at the same time. 2 problems, 1 solution. The room did not explode. It went through a sequence. First, a breath, collective involuntary, the sound of 600 people pulling air into their lungs at the same moment. Then, 3 full seconds of complete stillness, the kind that comes when people are processing something too large to process quickly. Then, the sound started. Low at first at the back tables building forward, like something rolling downhill voices. layering on top of voices, until the room was filled with something that had no politeness left in it at all. On the screen, the footage froze on the final frame. Derek's face, mid-sentence, lit clearly by the overhead lighting of a conference room. He had never thought to question, in a building he had never considered might belong to someone else. 2 million people watching from wherever they had tuned in. That evening, from living rooms and dinner tables and phones held up in the dark, saw the same frozen image at the same moment. The room was loud now. And then very suddenly, it wasn't. Derek said it was fabricated. The word came out thin, like something he was saying because he had nothing else. The room had not fully settled when Connor spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In a space that had gone from eruption to near silence, in the span of about 40 seconds, a voice delivered at a steady, even register, carries the way a stone carries, across still water, clean without effort, touching every edge of the room before the ripple disappears. The recording, Connor said, was captured by a fixed security camera in a commercial office building whose server infrastructure has been maintained by a Caldwell Group Technology subsidiary since the property transferred ownership 3 years ago. He had a folder open in his hand, and he was reading from it with the precise cadence of someone who has rehearsed the words enough times that they no longer feel like words, just facts lined up in order, patient and immovable, waiting to be delivered to the people who needed to hear them. The audio was processed through the building's existing surveillance system. The original file has been stored under continuous custody since the night it was recorded. The chain of documentation is intact and independently verifiable. He looked up from the page. The metadata, he said, has been notarized. Authenticated copies were delivered to the Houston field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 5:30 this evening, along with a full chain of custody filing. He paused. Before we arrived here tonight, Derek's mouth opened, closed. Additionally, Connor said, the tenant disclosure agreement for your office suite, page 11, paragraph 3, notifies all occupants of continuous monitoring throughout building infrastructure spaces. You signed that agreement, Derek. Your signature is on page 38. He set the folder down on the table with the quiet finality of a man returning something to its proper place. Consent was documented before you ever moved in. Fabricated, Derek said again. The word had less in it the second time. Considerably less. It was a position he was holding not because he believed it would change anything, but because abandoning it meant standing in front of 600 people with nothing at all between him and what that screen had just shown them. A man will hold a bad position longer than he should when the alternative is having no position at all. I said nothing. I had said what needed to be said. What came next belonged to Connor. Connor clasped his hands in front of him. The automotive technician, he said, who was contracted to perform maintenance work on your personal vehicle. In February of this year, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who has operated an independent repair shop in the Acres Homes neighborhood on the north side of this city for the past 19 years, walked into the 18th District Station on Lockwood Drive at 6:30 this evening. The room listened. All 600 of them. The kind of listening that has no sound in it, no movement, no fidgeting at the edges. The kind that only happens when people understand, on some level, below conscious thought, that what is being said in front of them is going to matter for a long time after the evening is over. Gerald Pruitt was 61 years old. He had been fixing other people's vehicles since he was 17, working out of his uncle's shop in Aldine before he saved enough to open his own place on West Tidwell Road. He was the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late and never charged for work he hadn't done. And in 19 years of business, he had built the kind of reputation that meant customers drove across the city rather than take their car somewhere closer. He was not a complicated man. He was not a brave man by his own accounting. He was a man who had been asked to do something in February that he understood in the moment he agreed to it that he should not have agreed to. And he had lived with that understanding for 8 months before the weight of it became heavier than the fear of what might happen if he put it down. He brought 3 things with him to the 18th district, Connor said. A set of tools, a series of photographs taken before and after the work, was performed on his personal phone, time-stamped, and stored on a cloud account in his own name. An assigned written statement, witnessed by a notary detailing every conversation he had with you. The dates, the locations, the specific instructions he was given, and the amount he was paid in cash to carry them out. Connor paused. Let the room absorb that. He also brought, Connor said, the original brake component itself. He let that sit for 3 full seconds. Gerald Pruitt had kept that component for 8 months. He had wrapped it in a shop cloth and locked it in a steel toolbox, bolted to the bed of his truck, which he parked in a different location every 2 weeks, a rotation he had established within 48 hours of completing the job, because some part of him had understood even then that what he was holding might be the only thing standing between him and a situation he couldn't talk his way out of. He had not come forward before tonight for a reason that was not complicated and required no particular sympathy to understand. He was afraid of you, Connor said. He kept it because having it gave him something, a small amount of protection, an insurance policy he hoped he would never need to cash in. Your fingerprints are on that component, Derek. 3 separate locations, identified and documented by a forensic technician at the Harris County Crime Lab, whose findings are included in the package delivered to federal investigators this afternoon. Derek had gone very still. The microphone was still in his hand. He hadn't put it down. I don't think he knew he was still holding it. He was afraid of you, Connor said again, for 8 months, and then something changed. He became more afraid of something else. The room held its breath. 600 people, and whatever number were watching through the broadcast feed, all of them waiting for the same thing. Derek's voice came out stripped down to the frame. The performance was gone. The precision was gone. The practiced confidence that had filled this room 2 hours ago, that had held a microphone and addressed hundreds of people like a man who owned the floor he was standing on, all of it had been evacuated. And what was left was smaller and more exposed than I had expected to find underneath it. What was he afraid of? Derek said. It came out barely above a murmur, not quite a question. The sound of a man asking something he already suspected the answer to and was hoping for reasons that no longer made any practical difference, that he was wrong. Connor looked at him for a moment, without speaking, taking the measure of the man in front of him with the particular stillness of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has no intention of rushing the last few steps. He was afraid, Connor said, of what you were going to do next. He let that land where it was going to land. As it turns out, he said he was right to be. The silence that followed had a different quality from the others. Not the shocked silence of the screen going dark. Not the held breath silence of the recording playing out. This was the silence of a room that had finished being surprised and was now simply waiting with the patient certainty of people who understand that the last piece of something is about to be placed and they are going to be present when it happens. Connor set the folder down on the table. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket slowly, without theater, the way you reach for something when you have been carrying it carefully for a long time and want to bring it out without damage. His hand came out holding a white envelope. Standard size, no markings on the outside. He placed it on the table between them without a word. Nobody touched the envelope for a moment. It sat on the table between Connor and Derek, the way certain objects sit when everyone in a room understands, without being told, that whatever is inside it is going to change the shape of the evening in a way that nothing that has come before quite managed to. Derek looked at it. His jaw was set. His shoulders were back. He was doing the work of appearing composed, and from a distance, if you didn't know what you were looking at, you might have believed it was working. Up close, it was not working. Open it, Connor said. Derek reached for this envelope with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided that the only remaining move available to him is to appear unafraid of what he is about to find. He lifted the flap, reached inside, pulled out what was there. The first item was a photograph, standard print size, the kind you get from a drugstore kiosk, when you want something physical to hold. It showed a boy, 7 years old, dark-haired, standing in what appeared to be a backyard somewhere, squinting against afternoon sunlight with the particular expression of a child who has been asked to hold still for a picture and has opinions about that request. He was wearing a blue jacket, 2 sizes too big for him, the sleeves rolled up at the cuffs. He was grinning anyway, in spite of the squint, in spite of the jacket, in spite of whatever instruction had been given to him about standing still. His name was Liam. He lived in Denver, Colorado, with his mother, the same woman whose voice had come through that screen 20 minutes ago, the same woman who had called my private line on a Tuesday morning in late July, with documents in hand and nowhere else left to turn. Derek set the photograph down on the table. He set it face down. Connor reached over and turned it back. The second item in the envelope was a document, not a copy, the original pulled from the Denver County Clerk's office through a title search company with no connection to anything bearing my name. It was a marriage certificate, 2 pages, standard state format, filed in the spring of 2016. The signatures at the bottom were clear and unambiguous. One of them belonged to Rachel Hines. The other belonged to the man standing on the other side of the table. I watched Derek read his own name on that document. I watched him read the date. I watched the calculation behind his eyes, run the arithmetic that he had been hoping, until this moment, he would not be required to run in front of 600 witnesses. Spring of 2016, I said. 8 months before you stood at an altar in Houston and made the same set of promises to my daughter. I let that number sit in the air between us. 8 months. Derek said nothing. Under Texas family law, I said, a marriage entered into by a person who is already legally married is not subject to annulment proceedings. It is not voidable on petition. I folded my hands on the table in front of me. It is void, as if it never existed. From the moment the second ceremony concluded, the document it produced had no legal standing. Not reduced legal standing, none. The room was very quiet. The particular quiet of people doing arithmetic of their own, which means, I said, that everything you believed you were entitled to through your marriage to my daughter, every asset claim, every inheritance, expectation, every legal standing you believed you held as her spouse was constructed on a foundation that had no force the moment you signed your name. I looked at him directly. You never had a marriage, I said. You had a performance, and you performed it in front of a judge and a minister and 200 guests, while a woman in Denver was raising your son. Across the room on the far side of the floor, where the guests had redistributed themselves over the course of the evening into loose clusters of people who no longer had any interest in pretending this was a normal event, I was aware of Megan. She had not moved from the position she had been in when I placed my jacket around her shoulders. She was standing with Connor's hand resting lightly at her elbow. He had positioned himself beside her sometime in the last 10 minutes, quietly, without drawing attention to it, the way he did most things that mattered. She was listening. Her face was composed in the particular way that costs something to maintain, that requires a decision every few seconds to keep in place. When the date landed spring of 2016, I watched her close her eyes, not dramatically, not for the room. She closed them the way you close your eyes when something arrives that you already suspected was coming, and the confirmation is both worse and easier than the anticipation. 3 seconds. Then she opened them. Her chin was level. Her hand was still resting against her stomach. She did not collapse. She did not look for somewhere to sit down. She stood where she was and absorbed what she had just heard and remained standing, and that more than anything else that had happened in that room tonight told me everything I needed to know about my daughter. Derek opened his mouth. The motion in his jaw was the last reflex of a man reaching for something, an objection, a reframing, a legal counter, some version of the words that might create enough ambiguity to buy him time. I had seen men reach for that particular kind of language in difficult rooms before. It rarely found what it was looking for. Connor raised one hand. "We're not finished," he said. The words were quiet. They were not a threat. They were simply a statement of fact. delivered by someone who had no reason to dress it up as anything else. 3 words, and the motion in Derek's jaw stopped. Connor reached back into the document case on the table beside him. His hand moved past the folders, past the remaining bound materials, to something near the bottom of the case, something smaller than everything else that had come out of it tonight. His fingers found it, and he brought it up slowly, the way you bring up something you have been careful with. A single sheet of paper. He set it on the table without turning it over. I watched Derek's face when he saw what it was. Derek recognized it before Connor turned it over. I could see it in this way his eyes changed. Not the slow recognition of a man reading something unfamiliar, but the fast, involuntary contraction of someone who has encountered a thing they hoped they would never have to account for in a room full of people. He knew what was on that paper. He had known the moment Connor's hand came up from the document case. Whatever composure he had been maintaining, whatever structure he had been holding together, through sheer force of practiced discipline, developed a fracture in that instant that no amount of performance was going to close. Connor turned the page over. It was a prescription form. Standard medical letterhead, the kind printed in bulk, for private practices operating out of professional office suites in the suburbs west of the city. The issuing physician maintained a practice in Katy, Texas, a small clinic that accepted cash payments and did not participate in any insurance network, the kind of arrangement that suits people who have reasons to prefer that certain consultations not appear in searchable records. The date at the top of the form was 2 weeks prior to tonight. The medication listed was not a common pharmaceutical. It was not something prescribed for the conditions it would have appeared to address on a surface reading. Connor did not name it directly. He didn't need to. What he said was this: the compound described on that form, if introduced into food or drink without the recipient's knowledge, would cause a tearily presenting loss of pregnancy within 48 hours. No external indicators. Nothing that would prompt a secondary inquiry under normal circumstances. He let the room process that. What the date on that form means, Connor said, is that Derek sought out this prescription 2 weeks ago, which means that 2 weeks ago, Derek was aware of something that as of tonight, Megan had not yet told anyone. He paused. He knew about the pregnancy, Connor said, before she did. The room did something I had not heard it do at any point in the previous 2 hours. It went beyond silence. There is a quality of stillness that exists past the ordinary absence of sound, a kind of collective suspension that happens when 600 people receive information that overrides every other thought they were having and replaces it with a single, undivided response. The room reached that place and stayed there. I did not look at Derek. I looked at Megan. She was holding the prescription form in both hands. Connor had passed it to her without ceremony, without preparation, because there was no way to prepare someone for what was written on it. She was reading it with the focused attention of a person who reads carefully, when the stakes are high enough, who does not skim when the words in front of her matter. Her eyes moved across the page at an even pace. They reached the bottom. They stopped. She looked down at her stomach, at the hand she had been resting there since before I arrived, since before any of this began, since the moment she first understood, in whatever private way a person understands such things, that she was no longer only herself. Then she looked up at me. Dad, one word. Her voice had been holding its shape all evening through things that would have undone most people. It had held through the champagne and the microphone and the 600 witnesses and the video on the screen and the photograph of a boy in Denver and the marriage certificate with her husband's name on it twice. It had held through all of it. It did not hold through that word. It broke at the edges, the way something breaks when it has been under pressure for too long, and the last increment of weight finally exceeds what the structure was built to carry. Not a collapse, not a breakdown. One word and the sound of 7 years of holding finally reaching its limit. I looked at the prescription form in her hands. I have been asked since that evening what I was thinking in the seconds that followed. The honest answer is that I was not thinking. Thinking is a process that requires distance between the stimulus and the response. a gap in which reason can insert itself and make the necessary adjustments. What happened in those 4 seconds did not have a gap. There was the form. There was my daughter's voice. There was the understanding of what those two things placed together meant about what had been planned for her and for the child she was carrying. And then there was my hand. I crossed the distance between us in 3 steps. What I delivered was open-handed, unhurried, in the way that things are unhurried when they have been building for 7 years and have finally arrived at the only form they were ever going to take. It connected with the left side of his face, and it carried with it every document signed and every subsidiary funded, and every evening spent in a parked car on a quiet street watching a light in a second-floor window. His head went hard to the right. His body followed. The edge of the table caught his shoulder on the way down, and he landed on the floor of the ballroom of the George R. Brown Convention Center, which was and had been for 4 years a Caldwell Group property. He lay there. The room did not move. Not one person, not one sound. 600 guests, and however many millions, had stayed with the broadcast, from wherever they were watching all of them, holding the same breath in the same moment, waiting to see what came next. I straightened my jacket, adjusted the left manchette, then the right, looked at my hand for 2 seconds, then looked away. Stack every charge laid out in this room tonight, I said. Add them up. Take as long as you need. I looked down at Derek on the floor. I will wait, I said. The silence held. Then, from the far side of the ballroom, at a table positioned along the south wall, with a clear sightline to the stage table 7, which I had arranged specifically for this purpose, 3 weeks prior, a woman stood up. She had been sitting there for 2.5 hours. She had arrived before the evening began, taken her seat without drawing attention, and spent the intervening time watching everything that had occurred in this room, with the trained, unhurried attention of someone who has spent the better part of 3 decades evaluating exactly this kind of evidence in exactly this kind of detail. Her name was Judge Patricia Weston. She had served on the federal bench for the Northern District of Texas for 17 years before her retirement. Before that, 12 years as a federal prosecutor. She was 64 years old, and she was the most legally consequential person in any room she entered, retired or otherwise. She stood up. The room tracked her without being asked. That is the thing about certain kinds of authority. It doesn't announce itself, doesn't require introduction, doesn't depend on anyone already knowing who you are. It moves through a space ahead of the person carrying it, and the people in that space respond before they have finished deciding why. Judge Patricia Weston crossed the ballroom floor toward the stage with the unhurried stride of a woman who had spent 30 years walking into rooms where what she was about to say would change the course of something, and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. The conversations running in low clusters across the room died out table by table as she passed. By the time she reached the stage, the ballroom was as quiet as it had been when the recording ended. She set a leather document case on the table, opened it, and addressed the room without preamble. 8 years ago, she said a woman named Grace Caldwell retained a patent attorney through a firm in Austin, Texas. The engagement was conducted privately through a limited liability entity with no connection to any Caldwell family business. The subject was a drilling optimization technology, a pressure differential system developed in 1997 by her husband during the early years of building Caldwell Energy Group. Judge Weston opened the folder to the first tab. In 1998, she said that technology was included in an asset sale conducted under financial duress. The original inventor believed those rights were gone permanently. He had sold them because he needed the capital. He had moved forward because that is what you do when you are building something and the alternative is not building it. She paused. Grace Caldwell had a different view of the matter. I had not known until an attorney called my office 14 months ago that my wife had done any of this. I had not known she retained the firm. I had not known she spent the last 6 months of her life working through a legal process that required pulling original documentation from a transaction nearly 25 years old. She had not told me. She had not told anyone. What Grace established, through months of quiet work, conducted in the final chapter of her life, was a registered patent held in the name of Megan Caldwell for a pressure differential drilling optimization process that had become a standard methodology across the Texas oil and gas industry. Judge Weston turned to the second tab, the technology currently in use across 17 active drilling operations in the Permian Basin and the Eagle Ford Shale, she said, including 3 projects developed by Holloway Development Group, falls within the scope of this patent. A forensic accounting review has assessed the total value of unlicensed use across all applicable operations. She looked up. $480 million, she said. The number sat in the room, the way large numbers sit when they belong to someone else. Patient, immovable, indifferent to whatever the person on the other side of them might be feeling. She told no one, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. I was not addressing the room or Derek or the 600 people who had been standing in this ballroom watching a 7-year plan unfold layer by layer. I was addressing Grace, who had been gone for 6 years, and whose absence I had carried with the same discipline I applied to everything else carefully, without complaint. She did it alone, I said, thinking not about what she was losing, but about what she was leaving behind. I had planned the sequence of this evening, down to the minute. I had managed the timing, arranged the witnesses, positioned every document, and held the structure together through patience and precision. I had not planned for this moment. I had not planned to learn, for the first time, standing in a room full of witnesses, the full scope of what my wife had done in the last months of her life, while I was at the office, believing she was resting. My eyes went to the middle distance, not to any person, not to any object. Just forward, into the space where you look when something arrives that is larger than the container you prepared for it. The discipline was still there, but what it was holding in those 4 seconds was not anger, not strategy. It was something older and less manageable. The particular weight of realizing that the person you loved most was still 6 years after she was gone, finding ways to protect the people she left behind. Judge Weston allowed the silence its full weight. Then she reached into the leather case and produced 2 documents folded together. The official seal of the Northern District of Texas was visible on the outer face of each. The first warrant, she said, covers conspiracy to commit a violent act against a protected person, along with coordinating bodily harm, signed by a duty magistrate at 2:45 this afternoon on the basis of the cooperating witness statement and physical evidence submitted through proper legal channels this morning. The second covers the unlawful administration of a harmful substance to a person without their knowledge or consent with intent to cause injury, signed at 3:30. She set both documents on the table. A team from the Houston field office, she said, has been in the building's service corridor since 7 o'clock this evening. She looked at Derek directly for the first time. Derek Allen Holloway, she said, you are under arrest. The room held its breath one final time. 600 people, and not one of them moving, not one of them speaking, waiting with the patient certainty of people who understand that the last piece of something is being set into place, and they are present to witness it. Then from the far end of the room, both panels of the main entrance simultaneously, with the kind of coordinated motion that does not happen by accident, the doors came open. She came through first, Sarah Kowalski, Special Agent, Houston Field Office, mid-40s, the kind of face that has spent 20 years reading rooms and no longer wastes time on the ones it has already read, moved through the parted crowd toward the stage with the same quality of forward motion I had used 2 hours ago. Not hurried, simply directed, certain of its destination. 3 agents followed behind her, along with 2 officers in uniform, all of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people executing a plan that was arranged well in advance. She stopped 2 feet in front of Derek. Derek Allen Holloway, she said, you are being placed under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, the court will appoint one for you. The handcuffs came out. The sound they made when they closed, that small, dry mechanical sound, moved through the ballroom, the way a period moves at the end of a very long sentence. Final, belonging to a category of sounds that cannot be walked back. Derek's composure lasted exactly as long as it took the metal to close around his wrists. Robert, his voice cracked on the syllable. Not theatrical, the raw sound of a man who has run completely out of options and is reaching in the last seconds before the reaching becomes impossible for the one thing he thinks might still be available to him. Whatever I did, I can make it right. The assets, every account, I'll sign it all over tonight. Just let me talk to Megan. 5 minutes, My daughter, I said, stepped out with her brother. She is safe. She will not be speaking to you tonight. I looked at him steadily. She will not be speaking to you again. The baby, he said. The word came out differently from everything else. Whatever performance remained in his voice was gone from that one word entirely. That child, I said, will be born into a family that loves her without condition and protects her without hesitation. What name she carries is Megan's decision, not mine, and certainly not yours. But I will tell you this, that child will not be told her father was beyond redemption. She will be told he was absent. There is a difference. I will give her that mercy even though you have not earned it. Agent Kowalski moved him toward the exit. I turned to face the room. 600 people who had come for an industry evening and witnessed something else entirely. I did not raise my voice. I never needed to. Some of you made choices earlier tonight, I said, about who to applaud, about who to look away from. I keep detailed records, but I am not here to hold a room accountable. I am here because my daughter needed someone to stand up. I left it there. Judge Weston was beside me. She extended her hand. Well done, Robert, she said. Grace did the real work, I said. I just kept the lights on long enough for it to matter. She nodded once. The nod of someone who understands completely and has nothing to add. I picked up my jacket, put it on, and walked toward the exit. Derek had already been moved through the main doors, the same entrance he had used 2 hours earlier when he walked in believing the evening was entirely his to direct. In the game of Caldwell, I said quietly to the room, and to no one in it, there is no such thing as a free move. I walked out. The corridor was cooler, quieter. Then, from the alcove near the east entrance, a figure stepped forward. Frank Caldwell was 69 years old, broad-shouldered, standing with the weight of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and made an incomplete peace with it. He said my name, one word, the way you say a name when you have rehearsed the conversation after it and still haven't decided which version to deliver. I stopped. You were my brother, I said, before you were my enemy. I want you to remember that I remembered that. Frank said nothing. He held my eyes, and in the silence between us was 20 years and one decision, and everything that had grown in the space that decision created. My attorneys will contact yours Monday morning, I said. Every conversation, every introduction, every arrangement, it's all documented. You know that. He nodded. Small, controlled, the nod of a man accepting something he has been expecting and could not find a way to be ready for regardless. I walked past him and through the corridor doors and out into the October night, where Connor had the SUV waiting at the curb with the engine running. I got in. The door closed. Connor pulled away without being asked, and I did not look back as the building disappeared behind us. It's done, I said. Not to Connor, not to the windshield or the highway or the city burning against the dark, to the parking lot receding in the mirror, to Grace. It's done. Megan was already in the back seat when I reached the SUV. She had my jacket still around her shoulders, the one I had placed there 2 hours ago, in a ballroom 30 blocks south, covering what needed to be covered, and neither of us had thought to replace it with anything warmer since. She was sitting with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, one resting lightly over her stomach, the way it had been all evening, that quiet, continuous gesture of protection that I had noticed the moment she appeared in that footage and had not been able to stop thinking about since. Connor pulled away from the curb without a word. The city opened up ahead of us, and I-10 stretched north through the Friday night in the easy, indifferent way of highways that have carried 1,000 versions of this same drive and will carry 1,000 more. The silence between the three of us was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that belongs to people who have been through something large together and have not yet found the first word that fits what comes after it. Connor drove. The city moved past the windows. The heat was on low, and the interior of the SUV had the particular warmth of an enclosed space that has been running long enough to feel settled. Megan looked out at the highway for a long time before she spoke. "Why did you let it go on so long?" she said. Her voice was quiet and even, the way voices get when someone has been holding a question for a long time and has finally decided that the cost of not asking it is higher than the cost of hearing the answer. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the lights of the city sliding past the glass. "Did you think I couldn't handle knowing?" I turned to look at her profile in the passing light. "No," I said. "I never thought that. I thought that if I came to you in the first year with documents and recordings and told you everything I suspected, you would have believed I manufactured it. You would have believed I was doing what I had always done, which was try to manage your life from a distance." I paused. "You would have married him anyway. And you would have done it without the legal protections I was building, without the documentation I was assembling, without any of the things that made tonight possible, instead of just painful." Megan was quiet. "I made a calculation," I said. "I have made a great many calculations over the course of my life, and most of them have been correct. This one was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either. I should have found a way to be closer, without making you feel managed. I did not find that way. I have known that for 5 years, and I did not know how to say it." She turned to look at me then, not with anger, with the particular expression of someone receiving information they had needed for a long time and are deciding in real time what to do with the fact that it has finally arrived. Connor's voice came from the front seat, quiet and unhurried. "Most nights, for the past 4 years, he said Dad would park on the street below your building in Montrose. He didn't announce it. He didn't tell me until the 2nd year, and only then, because I happened to call when he was sitting there and asked where he was. He kept his eyes on the road. He went to make sure your light was still on." Megan looked at the back of her brother's head. "He stayed," Connor said, "until it came back on." I looked out at the highway. "There were nights the light was off by 8 o'clock, I said. "Those were the nights I stayed longer, sitting in a parked car on Willard Street with the engine off and the city going about its business around me, waiting for the light in your 2nd-floor window to come back. I folded my hands in my lap. I was not going to let you disappear into the dark, Megan. Whatever distance you needed, whatever you needed to believe about standing on your own, I was always going to be on that street. That was never negotiable." The highway ran north. Houston thinned at the edges and became the quieter version of itself that exists past the loop, where the lights spread out and the sky gets a little more room. Megan made a sound that was somewhere between a breath and something else. Then she turned toward me and put her head against my shoulder, the way she had when she was 7 years old and had a nightmare she couldn't find the words for. Not tentatively, not with the careful, provisional quality of 2 people testing whether the distance between them has actually closed. The full, certain weight of someone who has decided something and is done deciding it. I put my arm around her. I did not say anything. Some things are not improved by words placed over the top of them. Some things are just weight and warmth, and the fact of being present after a long absence, and anything you add to that only gets in the way. We drove like that for a while. The city moved past. The heater ran. Connor kept the SUV at a steady speed and gave us the time, without being asked, the way he gives most things quietly, without drawing attention to the giving. Then I moved my hand, not deliberately, not with any particular intention, just the instinct of a man sitting next to his daughter who had been carrying something remarkable through one of the hardest evenings of her life and was still carrying it now, still present, still holding. I placed my palm gently against the side of her stomach, just resting there, Just present. The response was immediate. One kick. Strong, clean, decisive. The kind of movement that does not leave room for ambiguity about whether it happened. It lasted less than 2 seconds and stopped with the same sudden certainty with which it had started, as though whoever was responsible for it had said exactly what they wanted to say and was satisfied with having said it. Megan laughed. It came out surprised, unguarded, in the way that real laughter is always unguarded, the kind that arrives before you have decided to allow it. Warm, and sudden, and completely, entirely herself. The first genuine laugh I had heard from her in 5 years, startled out of her by someone who had already apparently developed opinions about the voices in her immediate vicinity. She does that, Megan said. When she hears a voice she doesn't recognize. From the front seat, Connor produced a cough that was not a cough. He covered it with one hand and returned that hand to the wheel, and said nothing, but his shoulders had shifted in a way that did not fool either of us. I said. I looked at Megan. Megan confirmed, and smiled, small, tired, completely real. The smile her mother used to smile when she already knew something the rest of the world was still catching up to. I looked down at my hand, still resting against the warm fabric of my jacket, still resting against whatever was on the other side of it, already making her opinions known. The highway carried us north. The city fell away behind us. And inside the SUV, in the particular warmth of that enclosed space, moving through the October night, with nowhere urgent left to be something that had been broken for 5 years, finished setting itself back into place. The house was quiet when we arrived. The kind of quiet that belongs to old houses after a long storm. Connor went to the kitchen without being asked. The familiar percussion of it followed us into the entrance hall cabinet, opening water, running the particular sequence that had been Grace's ritual at the end of difficult evenings. She would disappear and return with tea, without ceremony, without asking if anyone wanted any. Over the years, the ritual had outlasted her passing into Connor, the way certain things pass through families, not taught, but absorbed. Megan stood in the entrance hall and looked at the house. 5 years is long enough for the familiar to become strange. She stood there and read the room the way you read something you used to know completely, the dark wood paneling, the grandfather clock. Grace had refused to have adjusted because she said a clock that runs a little slow reminds you not to rush the smell of old books and candle wax underneath everything. She took it in slowly, without rushing it. I led her to the library. The candles were already lit, the way Grace had preferred the room in the evenings. The portrait above the mantel caught the light. Grace, at 46, dark-haired, looking slightly to the left of the painter, with the expression she always had when she was thinking about something she hadn't yet decided to say. Megan stopped when she saw it. I went to the desk and opened the bottom drawer. The envelope was where it had always been, cream-colored, the handwriting faded, but unmistakably hers. For Megan, when the storm has passed. I brought it to her. She saw the handwriting before I had fully extended my hand. When did she write this? Megan said. 1 month before she passed, I said. She gave it to me herself right here. She told me to keep it until you needed her voice more than you needed advice. She said I would know when. Megan broke the seal and unfolded the pages. She read aloud, her voice low, with a slight unevenness at the edges she didn't try to hide. Megan, my love, if your father has given you this, you have been through something that hurt you in a way I couldn't protect you from. I'm sorry for that. She paused, then continued. You are going to love someone who does not deserve it. That is what generous hearts do. Don't be ashamed of that. The love was real even when the person wasn't worthy of it. Your capacity to love is not made smaller by the fact that someone failed to honor it. Megan lowered the page briefly, then raised it again. Your father will be there. He will not catch you immediately. And if you are reading this feeling angry at him for that, I asked him not to. You needed to find your own footing first. But he will be on the street below your window, Megan. He will always be on the street below your window. That is who he is. She set the letter on her knee. The candles moved. Grace looked slightly left of where we were sitting, with the expression of someone who has already thought 3 moves ahead. She knew, Megan said. She knew everything about me, I said. Usually before I did. There are 2 more things, I said. 1, Grace arranged. 1, I did. The first was the Grace Caldwell Legacy Trust, $500 million, structured as a protected generational asset, established 8 years ago. It had been administered through investment vehicles that intersected with Derek's company over the years without him ever knowing the beneficiary's identity. The trust transferred to her daughter upon birth. It could not be contested or accessed by anyone except the named beneficiary and her legal guardian. You, I said. Megan sat with that. The stillness of someone processing something simultaneously, too large and exactly right. Then I brought the album from the bottom drawer. Dark green cover, no label. She opened it. November 5 years ago. Megan at the farmer's market on Westheimer Road, laughing at something the vendor said. Completely real. I remembered standing across the street thinking she's all right. She's still laughing. She turned pages. A coffee shop on Montrose. The running path along Buffalo Bayou. Then she stopped. Houston Methodist Hospital. The main entrance at night. And through the lobby glass, barely visible, a figure in a gray coat sitting near the information desk with his hands folded on his knees. You were inside, she said quietly. You slipped on the ice in February, I said. Hairline fracture. 4 hours in the emergency room alone. I paused. I was in the lobby until 2:40 in the morning. Why didn't you come in? Because you needed me to stay outside long enough to build a case you would actually believe, I said. If I had walked through those doors, Derek would have known he was being watched. We would have lost everything. Connor had my arm the entire time. He was right to hold me there. That didn't make it easier. Megan closed the album, set her hand flat on the cover. Then she stood up, and I stood up, and she crossed the space between us and put her arms around me. Not tentatively, not with the careful quality of 2 people testing whether a distance has closed. The full, certain hold of someone who has come home and knows it. I held her. The baby shifted between us, unhurried, making her presence known in the particular way she had already established as her own. I should have done some of this differently, I said into her hair. Not all of it, but some of the middle. She was quiet for a moment. You stood outside my window for 5 years, she said. Her voice was steady, close entirely, without anger. I think that counts. She arrived at 6:14 in the morning. April in Houston, the month the city finally commits to warmth after the long, indecisive drag of February and March, when the humidity softens and the light through hospital windows turns generous and almost kind. The kind of morning that feels, without announcing it, like a beginning. Connor and I had been in the corridor for 5 hours. We had arrived at Houston Methodist before midnight, found the waiting area outside the maternity ward, and settled in the particular way you settle when you know the timeline is not yours to manage. Connor had coffee that went cold by 1 in the morning and didn't bother replacing it. I had a paperback I had picked up from the gift shop downstairs and did not open. We sat. We waited. We said very little because very little needed saying, and because both of us understood that what was happening on the other side of that corridor door was something that would arrive in its own time, and not a moment before. At 6:14, a nurse opened the door. Her face told us before her words did. Mr. Caldwell, she said. You can come in. The cry had come through the wall about 3 minutes earlier. Short, immediate, carrying with it the particular quality of something that has just arrived and wants the room to know it. Not distress, not confusion, more like announcement. The sound of someone who has made a decision about being present and is not ambivalent about it. Megan was propped against the pillows with the exhausted brightness of someone who has just done something very hard and is still running on the energy of having done it. Damp hair at the temples, completely, quietly satisfied in the way that exists past the reach of ordinary words. She held out her arms slightly when I walked in, the gesture of someone offering the most important thing they have ever held. I sat beside the bed and took my granddaughter for the first time. She was the weight of a decision. That is the only way I know to describe it. The particular, irreversible weight of something that changes every calculation you have made about the future and makes you glad that it does. She was asleep, or something close to it. Her face had the concentrated inward expression of a person still orienting to the fact of existing, still running some internal assessment of conditions, and finding them tentatively acceptable. Then she frowned, not in distress, in concentration, the brow pulling together in a small, decisive furrow that I recognized, before I had finished registering it, the expression Grace used when she was reading something worth paying attention to, when she had found something in the page that required the full allocation of her focus. I had watched that expression for 31 years across breakfast tables and library chairs, in the front seat of every car we had ever owned together. She has Grace's frown, I said. The one my wife got when she was reading something worth paying attention to. Megan smiled, tired and real and entirely herself. Connor was standing at the foot of the bed. He had his phone in his hand, face down, and he set it on the windowsill before he spoke. The sentencing was, "This morning," he said carefully. "Federal Court, Northern District. The judge ran the counts together. The conspiracy charge, the unlawful substance charge, the bigamy, the financial fraud." He paused. "He won't be released in his lifetime." The room held that for a moment. Megan looked down at the baby in my arms. She touched the edge of the white receiving blanket, straightened a fold that didn't need straightening, and when she looked up, her face was composed and clear, and finished with something. "The only sound that matters in this room," she said, "is her breathing." Connor set his phone face down on the windowsill and left it there. "That name," I said, "does not enter any room she is in. We don't read from that chapter again." Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. I stood and carried her to the window. Houston was waking up below the medical center's campus, coming to life in the early light traffic, beginning to move on Fannin Street, the particular organized energy of a city resuming its business after a night of being a city. The sky to the east had gone from black to the deep blue that precedes sunrise, and the light falling through the hospital glass was the generous April light I had noticed when we arrived, the kind that makes things look the way they actually are, rather than the way the dark makes them seem. I held her toward this window, not dramatically, just enough that the morning light fell across her face. She blinked, considered the light with the same focused frown, decided after a moment that it was acceptable. "You come from good stock, Grace Caldwell," I said quietly. Behind me, Megan said nothing, but I heard her smile. That evening, the three of us stood on the back balcony of the Caldwell house on Memorial Drive. Connor had appeared from the kitchen with 3 cups of tea on a tray, without being asked. Grace's ritual continued without discussion, the way it always had been. He handed one to Megan first, then to me, kept the third for himself, and leaned against the railing beside his sister. The Houston skyline sat to the south, lit against the April dark. The night was mild, the air carrying the particular softness that comes after a long winter finally releases its hold, and the three of us stood with our tea and looked at the city the way this family has always looked at it, not as something to admire, but as something to reckon with. A thing built by human hands over human time, full of human decisions and still standing. "Have you decided on a name?" Connor asked. Not casually, carefully, the way you ask something, when the answer matters, and you don't want the asking to diminish it. Megan wrapped both hands around her cup. "Grace," she said. "Grace Caldwell." The name landed the way the right names land, with weight and with rightness, the two arriving together. Connor looked at his tea and nodded once slowly, the way he nods when something is too important to rush past. I said nothing. I set my hand gently against Megan's stomach. Connor set his beside mine. After a moment, Megan placed her own hand over ours. 3 hands, 3 generations. The one here, the one arriving, and somewhere behind both of us. The one who had been thinking 3 moves ahead since before any of this began. Grace moved. Not the single decisive kick from the drive home, but something slower and more exploratory. A long, unhurried shift from one side to the other. The movement of someone taking stock of her situation and finding it on preliminary assessment worth remaining in. The sky to the east had begun its first faint suggestion of change. Not light yet, Just the quality of the dark, becoming something slightly different from what it had been, the way a night ends, not all at once, but by degrees, each degree so small, you can't identify the moment it crossed over. "It's almost morning," Connor said. "Yes," I said. I looked at Megan, at the skyline, at the three hands resting together in the dark. "It is." 3 months later, I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I knocked on my daughter's door. She opened the door on the second knock. Megan was wearing a gray sweatshirt and had the particular expression of someone who has been awake since before they wanted to be and has made their peace with it. Behind her, the apartment was lit with the low, horizontal light of a Houston morning, coming through east-facing windows, the kind of light that makes ordinary spaces look like they have been considered carefully, rather than assembled by circumstance. She stepped back to let me in without saying anything. That was new. 5 years ago, she would have said something. The silence was not unfriendly. It was the silence of two people who no longer need the words that used to fill the space between them. I had parked in the lot off Westheimer and walked the half block to her building, not on the street below her window, through the front entrance, up the elevator, down the third-floor hallway to apartment 314. The ordinary route that ordinary visitors take when they have been invited, which I had been by a text message the previous Wednesday that said simply Saturday morning, and to which I had replied, "I'll bring the coffee." I had brought the coffee. Grace was in the small bouncer seat near the kitchen window, positioned to catch the morning light in the particular way that suggested Megan had thought about it. 3 months old, dark-haired, with the focused, assessing expression she had arrived with and had not since abandoned. She was wearing a yellow onesie with a small embroidered bee on the chest, and she was studying the movement of light on the ceiling with the concentrated attention of someone conducting research. I set the coffee on the counter and crouched down to her level. She looked at me, the brow pulled together in the small, deliberate furrow that I had first seen in a hospital room in April, and that had not surprised me then, and did not surprise me now. She was running her assessment, taking stock, arriving after a moment at whatever preliminary conclusion the data supported. "She'll do," I said. Megan laughed from the kitchen doorway, her hands wrapped around the cup I had brought for her. Not politely, the real kind, the kind you can't produce on demand. We sat at the kitchen table and drank our coffee and talked the way people talk when the large things have been settled and the ordinary ones are available again. She told me about a structural project she was consulting on in Midtown, a mixed-use development that had interesting bones and a client with unclear ideas about what he actually wanted. I told her about a land acquisition in the Hill Country that Connor was managing, the kind of transaction that requires patience and a tolerance for bureaucratic delay that Connor had developed more of than I had expected. We talked about whether Grace was going to have her grandmother's patience or her grandfather's absence of it, and agreed that the evidence so far pointed in one direction, and it was not mine. I told her because she asked that the matters related to the previous October had been resolved through proper channels. Rachel and her son in Denver were receiving regular support drawn from the frozen accounts processed before any other claim. The arrangement had been formalized through the court and was being maintained without issue. Frank had accepted the terms presented by my attorneys, the restructuring of his equity position, the agreement not to contest, and had done so without litigation. I did not editorialize. She did not ask me to. She nodded once, the way she nods when she has filed something and is ready to move on. We finished our coffee. I held Grace for 20 minutes while Megan returned 3 messages she had been putting off. Grace spent the time conducting a thorough inventory of my face, the ceiling, my left hand, and a point somewhere over my right shoulder that apparently warranted significant attention. She did not reach a definitive conclusion about any of them. She was in this, as in everything, thorough. When I left, Megan walked me to the door. She hugged me, not the full certain hold of the library in October, but the comfortable everyday kind that belongs to people who have decided that showing up is sufficient and proof is no longer required. I walked back to the parking lot in the Houston morning And somewhere between the elevator and the sidewalk, I thought about what I would say if someone asked me what I had learned from the previous 7 years of my life. Not what I had accomplished, what I had learned. The honest answer is that I learned the difference between being present and being prepared. I was prepared for everything. I had the documentation, the legal structure, the patient accumulation of evidence across 7 years. I had the witnesses, and the timing, and the room. I was prepared in the way that a man who has spent his life building things learns to be prepared completely methodically, with every contingency accounted for. What I was not for too many of those years was present. Don't wait the way I waited. That is the first thing I would say. Don't let the perfect case you are building in your head become a reason to delay the imperfect conversation you should be having in person. Say the hard thing earlier. Be in the room before you have all the answers, because the people who need you do not need your answers. They need you. The people you love don't need a flawless architect. They need you available, honest, and willing to be wrong. Those 3 things done consistently over time accomplish more than any plan I have ever constructed. Family justice is not a verdict delivered in a ballroom. I know that now, in a way I did not know it fully before. It is not the moment when the evidence is presented and the room goes quiet and the right people are held accountable for the things they have done. That moment matters. But it is not where family justice lives. It lives in every quiet, daily choice to show up for the people who carry your name and your history, and the accumulated weight of everything you have built together. Every grandpa's story, at its core, comes down to one thing. Not the strategy, not the resources, not the 7 years of careful, patient architecture that I am not going to pretend did not matter, because it did. It comes down to being on the street, below the window. Even when no one knows you are there. Even when the light goes off early and you sit in the dark and wait for it to come back on. That is the whole of it. Everything else is detail. If this story reached something in you, if any part of it sat with you, the way the stories that matter tend to sit, I would be glad to know it. Leave a word in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, because these stories travel further than I expect them to. And the people they find always surprise me. Share it with someone who needs to hear that showing up even imperfectly, even late, is never without value. And if you want to be here when the next one begins, the button is there. I am grateful for the company. A note before I go. The story you have just heard contains fictional elements shaped for the purposes of reflection and for the kind of truth that sometimes lives more honestly inside an invented life than a documented one. The names, the places, the specific events, these are constructed. The questions underneath them are not. My name is Robert Caldwell, and this Grandpa story ends here.